Surprising and breaking news was made this past week on TV. Prime Minister Kishida, who has coronavirus now and is now working in quarantine, made a sudden announcement that from September 7th, the 72-hour pre-departure PCR test for overseas arrivals will no longer be required for those who have been vaccinated with at least 3 doses. He also added that he's going to raise the cap on daily foreign arrivals and entries. I heard that it may be raised from the present 20,000 entries a day to 50,000 entries. So things may be starting to move. But hey everyone, this is Mike Matsuno. This is the Man in Japan channel. On this channel, we talk about Japan. I try to keep people abreast about what's going on in Japan, news, trends. If you're interested in Japan, this is your first time, you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that like button and subscribe. Personally, I was very surprised at Prime Minister Kishida's unexpected announcement and even more surprised that he even set a date, September 7th. I thought the Japanese government would wait until the 7th surge subsided, as it still has not reached its peak yet in Japan. But by Prime Minister Kishida setting a date at September 7th, this will put some urgency to the process. For Japan, this was breaking news, and it does seem to be the first positive step towards cautiously edging the door open. However, these 2 announcements alone are not enough for the Japanese tourism and hospitality industry or all of you who have been patiently waiting to visit Japan on your own. They, and I'm sure most of you, all want the Japanese government to open up to independent tourists and travelers. This is the final goal for everyone who is waiting for that final approval for the opening up of borders to independent tourists and travelers. In fact, this past week, there was an article about a questionnaire that was done by a company which found that 91% of overseas respondents found the present entry controls too strict. 72% of foreigners said they will not visit Japan until the present entry restrictions are changed. The primary complaint was the mandatory group package tour requirement. This was similar to what I had talked about in an earlier video where I believe that only 20% of visitors would use group package tours. Thus, 80% of tourists and visitors will not come to Japan. The 72-hour pre-departure PCR test was always a big problem for many people coming to Japan because of, first, the cost. Since less destinations are now requiring the PCR test, PCR testing sites have closed down, but this has resulted in the cost of the PCR test increasing to 10,000 to 25,000 yen. Many argued about the logic of the 72-hour PCR test, that people could still be infected by the coronavirus within the 72-hour period and that testing should be done on arrival, if at all. So if the PCR test is eliminated on September 7th and the number of entries are increased, you would logically think that the next step might be to open up Japan to independent tourists and travelers. But the question is when? And I'm sure they will wait a while to first see how no longer doing PCR tests and the increase of entries, how they're affecting the number of new coronavirus numbers. Thus, I think if and when they start to open up to some independent tourists, it still will be closer to what I had predicted back in June. The earliest Japan will probably open up is November, December 2022, and depending on unknown variables, it may even be in early 2023. But also keep in mind what the Nikkei Asia wrote in an article. Some restrictions could remain in place. For instance, tourists with valid visas will still be required to enter on group tours, but they will no longer need to be accompanied by a guide. What exactly does this mean? I'm sure no one knows at this point. It looks like it's going to be another confusing issue that will take some time to resolve. Prime Minister Kishida also added that we will ease the COVID restrictions gradually in view of the needs of people in and outside Japan so that travel to and from Japan will become as smooth as it is for the other group of 7 economies. We heard something like this back in May 2022, so I'm not holding my breath. But what we should all remember is that with the new announcement about the PCR test and increased number of entries, these recent changes in policy are only addressing the symptoms to the deep-rooted problem which I had talked about in an earlier video. It is the core issue, which is the elephant in the room that no one in the government seems to want to address and resolve. Without addressing this major issue, nothing will really change and the same crisis situation will continue to repeat itself. If anything, it will naturally get worse as more tourist travelers and foreigners in general are allowed into Japan. First, although Japan has the most number of hospitals and hospital beds in the world, when it comes to the number of hospital beds for COVID patients, they are presently very limited and there's not enough for many places in Japan. That is why in every surge, the same problem repeats itself. There are not enough hospital beds designated for COVID patients. The big problem that still plagues Japan is that there are over 140 million people quarantining at home. For most people, if they have been vaccinated, the symptoms are quite mild and they recover on their own. But for those older senior citizens and those people with underlying medical symptoms or conditions, especially those who live alone, the symptoms sometimes can get so severe that they are unable to call an ambulance and they die at home without any help. In addition, even if someone is able to call an ambulance, depending on where you live in Japan, you may not be able to find a hospital that will accept you due to the lack of COVID hospital beds. In a past video, I talked about how Japan has more hospitals and more hospital beds than any other country in the world. However, Japan has a critical medical systemic problem due to the lack of COVID patient beds, COVID trained staff, the public versus private hospital organization issue, and how the government seems helpless to resolve this recurring problem. If you're interested in this subject, please watch this video. Remember what Albert Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I do not know if there are behind the scenes progress to address this problem, but at least from what I can see, the Japanese government has not made any progress to resolve this issue. Part of it is that this is a very complex, systemic problem, and in addition, the medical lobby is very strong, and the Japanese government may be intimidated to take on the medical lobby to make the necessary reforms and changes. The government would have to take more of an authoritative role than just asking nicely for more COVID beds. No government person really wants to talk about this issue, so it may not seem to be a priority, out of sight, out of mind. But please don't be fooled or think that the urgent medical needs for many more COVID beds in Japan is better now because Prime Minister Kishida is step by step gradually moving towards removing some restrictions of entering Japan. Because it's not, and the elephant in the room is still there. People in critical COVID situations are still unable to find a hospital to accept them. Others have died in ambulances while waiting for a COVID hospital room to open up. The visa issue is still the primary problem for many to come to Japan. Before, you would not need a visa and would be issued a tourist visa on arrival. But now you have to take your photo and application to the consulate or embassy and then wait 1 or 2 weeks and go back and pick it up. And usually there's an administrative fee. I think it's about 3,000 yen for a single entry. Although this is also one of the top complaints of overseas tourists, the Japanese government probably will continue this visa application process to control the number of tourists as well as to have data on who is coming into Japan. News outlets on the internet keep misleading the readers. For example, although the government has been allowing up to 20,000 arrivals per day, organizations like Japan National Tourism Organization said that only 140,000 visited Japan in July, a small fraction of the 3 million who landed in the same month in 2019, the year before the pandemic. But if you're honestly talking about visitors who are tourists and arrived on a tourist visa, it's only 8,000, not 140,000. So it's even much worse. The bulk majority of the 140,000 are trainees, business people, international students, interns, etc. But they're not tourists. So the comparison should be 8,000 tourists compared to the millions that came in July of 2019. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, I really would appreciate if you would subscribe. It helps with the momentum of the channel and of course making videos. I'm always trying to give you the best of what I think. Not that it's always correct, but I think that I give you a different perspective on what's going on in Japan and what may happen in Japan. So until next time, arigato.